able to see.
Yes, seeing is important.
Okay. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. So I'm further down on the list, right, Elle?
You are first on action agenda.
Oh.
So you're further on the list, but the first 5 or 6 are consent.
So I'm actually first.
Yeah.
Yeah, we always do the best first, Christonia.
Exactly.
Oh, there you go. How are you, Mr. Gecker?
Good. How are you? Please call me Dan.
Great.
So just to let everybody know, we are live streaming on YouTube. We're waiting for folks to get on, and then we'll get started right at 10.
Great.
Great.
I'll go ahead and just pull up the title slide just so folks know.
Okay.
Title slide for the board meeting, just so folks know that this is the right one. And that we are going to get started here in just a minute. And Dan, I'll pull this down as soon as we have everybody on.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Dr. Wilson.
Good morning.
I will say you did an excellent job chairing the meeting yesterday.
You did.
Well, thank you. I was glad to be able to help. I hope Keisha's feeling a little better today.
Unfortunately, she's not. She's actually not going to be able to join us. But
It's probably for the best. Actually.
yeah, she, I think she powered through yesterday. She just needs to rest.
Yeah.
Yeah, my cat is mad at me. I've made her stay outside the room today since she likes to get up in the screen.
I feel like every time we have a meeting, she wants to be front and center.
Yeah, I've said before, great disdain for me, except when I'm on Zoom.
Yeah. She just wants to be the star.
Wants to show off her cuteness, as we used to say about the kids.
Yeah.
Except when you want them to show off their kids, and then they become shy.
Dr. Mann, good morning.
Good morning. Myself situated.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Sonia.
Good morning, Sonia.
Morning, Sonia.
Good morning, Dr. Duran.
Good morning. How are you today?
Good. Good morning, Miss Holton.
Good morning.
Ms. Holton is back and outside again.
I am. It's just too good. If I've got to work, I might as well enjoy the fresh air, though. That reminds me, I'll put my earphones in so you don't have to hear the mowing, etc. The birds you won't mind.
Yeah.
Are we public yet?
Yes, we're live.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Pam. How
Good
are
morning,
you?
Pam.
Very well. I hope you guys are too.
So, Pam, are you strategically situated on a hill across from the school or what?
that is a very old photo.
Yeah,
That tree is no longer there and that marquee is no longer on the wall, but it is what it is. Very proud of it.
Good morning, everybody. For those joining, just want to let you know that we are live on YouTube and we will get started here in just a couple of minutes.
we'll say it's another morning that I miss our meeting room. It would be nice to get together again fairly soon.
Now with your banner background, we can't tell what setting you're in. So I hope you're somewhere comfortable. Wonderful.
Oh yeah, in the home office, but it's like the rest of everything, a mess. Just to use the backgrounds. It saves putting things in the cabinets,
You must be like me, Dan. I have to have everything spread out.
It is all spread out and it is a complete mess, but
Organized mess.
exactly. I can tell you where everything is.
Mm-hmm.
This is Susan Williams. I just wanted to say good morning to everyone.
Good morning, Susan. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Morning, Susan.
Good morning.
All right, I got it at 10. I see Dr. Lane has joined. Emily, I think we've got everybody who's coming, right?
Yep, I think we are all here. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share screen so we can see everyone's video.
Oh, wow.
And we're all set. Turn it over to you.
Good, thanks. Then we'll call the meeting of the board to order. First thing is the roll call. Ms. Holton,
I present.
Ms. Davis-Vaught,
Present.
Dr. Duran,
Present.
Dr. Wilson,
Present.
and Dr. Mann.
Present.
Excellent. As I said, coming into this, I still am missing the in-person meetings and the time we've had together. I'm hopeful that y'all are staying safe and, one day soon we'll be able to get together as a board in person. In any event, good morning. Welcome to the Board of Education's virtual meeting. Our meeting today is being streamed live on the VDOE YouTube channel and on the board's public meeting webpage. We'd like to welcome those joining us on the live stream from across the Commonwealth. A couple of things to note about our virtual meeting. The board has accepted written public comment for this meeting. All comments that were received by 5 p.m. on Tuesday have been uploaded to our meeting webpage and shared with board members in time for them to review in advance of today's meeting. Comments received after 5 p.m. on Tuesday will be provided to the board in a timely manner. For our YouTube watchers, the chat feature is disabled as it is not monitored by staff. The best way to contact the board is by email at that's as in boy or board, OE@DOE, as in Department of Education, .virginia.gov. Since we are meeting virtually, we will do a roll call vote for each item. Please be sure to speak clearly so that the staff can accurately capture your vote for the meeting minutes. Before we move to the consent agenda, I do want to recognize that we have a resolution to commemorate November 2020 as Family Engagement and Education Month. And I guess a lot of our families have engaged more in education than they ever expected to, not just this month, but since March. The Board of Education believes that families and schools working together can create meaningful relationships that lead to significant gains in student achievement and success. Over 30 years of research clearly indicates all students achieve at higher levels when schools and families support each other. Family Involvement in Education Month is an opportunity to recognize the importance of families and schools and the work being done throughout the Commonwealth to ensure that we work together to build better futures for all children. It is also an opportunity to recognize that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the operation of our public and private schools, parents have had to take on a more direct role in the education of their children. The board and the Virginia Department of Education strongly encourage local school officials to develop plans and policies to enhance family engagement in their children's schools, lives, and in the education community. Okay, so that covers that resolution. Item G on the consent agenda, we're going to have a couple of recusals. So can we get a motion to adopt, excuse me, let me do the approval of minutes, which I tend to forget. Has everybody had a chance to read the September 16 and September 17 minutes of the board? If so, is there a motion to approve, or in the alternative, a motion to approve with corrections?
Motion to approve.
Oh, I missed that one.
Pam?
Thank you.
Tammy seconds.
Perfect. I'm glad somebody's paying attention. All right, we have a motion to second. All in favor? Oh, can't do that anymore either. All right, roll call. Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
Dr. Mann?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Okay, the consent agenda, as I just mentioned, item G will have some recusals for different pieces. Is there a motion to adopt items A through F? And of course, A is the resolution that we just discussed.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Again, roll call. Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
And Dr. Mann?
Aye.
Okay. For item G, let's separate out, I guess, George Mason and University of Richmond. Is there a motion to approve all the items on item G other than UR and George Mason?
Motion to.
Thank you, Ms. Davis-Vaught. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, I think Dr. Mann?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. Roll call on this. Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
Dr. Mann?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Okay, a motion to approve the new education endorsement programs at George Mason. I believe Ms. Holton will recuse.
Yes.
Is there a motion for that?
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Davis Vaught. Again, roll call. I said Ms. Holton's recused. Well, Ms. Holton, you're recused. Ms. Davis
Yes.
Vaught,
Peru.
Aye.
Dr. Duran,
Aye.
Dr. Wilson,
Aye.
Dr. Mann,
Aye.
and I vote aye. And now a motion to approve the new education endorsement program at University of Richmond.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Davis Vaught. Again, by roll call. Ms. Holton,
Aye.
Ms. Davis Vaught,
Aye.
Dr. Duran,
Aye.
Dr. Mann.
Aye.
I'm assuming, Dr. Wilson, you are recusing, and I vote aye. Okay, so that all carries. All right. A quick move from A to G, and now we move on to H and begin, I guess, the real business of the meeting. Final review of the proposed recommendations by the Governor's Commission on African American History Education in Virginia. Ms. Brown?
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Mr. Gecker, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Lane, members of the board. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear our presentation. It is my pleasure to bring to you for final review the recommendations for edits for the Governor's Commission on African American History Education in Virginia. Thank you, Emily. Next slide. As you may remember from the September meeting, we discussed the work of the Standards Subcommittee led by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and specifically their recommendations regarding the process, standards reorganization, and technical edits. Next slide. The technical edits work group led by Dr. Ed Ayers was given direction and definition as they reviewed the curriculum frameworks for Virginia Studies, United States History to 1865, United States History, 1865 to the present, and Virginia and US History. Next slide. Those recommendations were reviewed by the department staff from various offices, as you can see listed there. And then they were sent to the superintendent and senior leadership for review of the document. And it included the original language from the curriculum frameworks from 2015, the edits as recommended by the commission, the type of edit and DOE suggestions, and then recommended action. Next slide. At the September 17th board meeting, staff presented subcommittee's recommendations organized in two categories, with the caveat that the department staff would further review the recommendations from category 2 and may make additional changes to incorporate the content into the curriculum frameworks. Next slide. Since the September 17th meeting, department staff did review the recommendations and were placed in category 2 and incorporated many of the recommendations in different locations of the curriculum frameworks. We also received and reviewed feedback from the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium, and then took all of the recommendations from category 2 that were placed in different locations of the curriculum frameworks back to the historians from the Standards Subcommittee for their discussion. Then lastly, we also developed a projected timeline for the review and revision process that's upcoming. So at this time, what I would like to do is to go through the different attachments that are attached to the boilerplate to give you a little bit more in-depth idea of what was done. So attachment A is the entire curriculum frameworks with all of the changes, recommendations from the commission. Next slide. In particular, we brought up to you at the September 17th meeting a standard. As an example, VUS 6D, the subcommittee, if you wouldn't mind clicking, Emily. The subcommittee, thank you, and click once more. Thank you. Go back. The subcommittee made a recommendation for this particular standard that had a lot of content for the essential understanding. This was an example of a recommendation that we placed in category 2. Next slide. Once we reviewed, and click again, Emily. There it is. Once we reviewed the content, we were able to move the content that was recommended into a different location for the curriculum framework for instructional flow and clarity for teachers. Next slide. So upon further review, the department reorganized the recommendations again for instructional flow and clarity, and I apologize for the plane that's going over right now, for instructional flow and clarity of the content. Attachment B is a chart that outlines all of the changes for the curriculum frameworks. Department staff will use this chart to populate resources for teachers, schools, school divisions, as they incorporate the changes into their local division curriculum. We have recommendations presented by the commission, and the History and Social Science program will be meeting with the Virginia Social Studies Leaders Consortium next week to discuss their support in populating this chart. This organization, in full support of the recommendations, is comprised of social studies division leaders, museums, and organizations with a history and social science purpose. Next slide. Attachment C identifies those items that were recommended by the standard subcommittee, but will be considered for the upcoming review and revision process, as many of them require additional research and or input from affiliate organizations or groups. Next slide. Thank you. Attachment D is a little different. This is for the board's consideration, as it is outside of the official review and revision process. Attachment D proposes an additional substandard for Virginia US .8. This particular substandard would specifically discuss lynching, asking students to analyze the impact of lynching and the racial terror on the lives of African Americans, and explain the efforts used to combat widespread lynching taking place in the 1890s and beyond. As the committee's recommendations were incorporated and can be found in attachment A as they recommended them, we are proposing that this content was duplicated in the middle school history course, and the same was put into the high school history course. With this proposal of this substandard, it considers the difference in content depth and skill level. It also provides an opportunity for deeper exploration and synthesis of evidence from primary and secondary sources. If you wouldn't mind clicking once, Emily. Thank you. So this content, again, proposes an opportunity for deeper exploration. Over the past 102 years, there has been over 200 pieces of legislation proposed to combat lynching at the national level. The content added in this particular substandard would give students in the high school history course an opportunity to explore not only the past, but the relevancy of the present. again, the original recommendation has been incorporated in the curriculum frameworks for U.S. history, 1865 to the present, and Virginia and U.S. history. But again, the content that they recommended was a duplicate of one another. That's why we are proposing the attachment D. Attachment E outlines a projected timeline for the upcoming review and revision process, but it also includes the communications and the implementation of the subcommittee's recommendations for edits. It also includes the expansion of the review and revision process. And lastly, it proposes streamlining the documents for the review and revision process of the standards and the curriculum framework to be done simultaneously. Next slide. So our next steps, upon your approval, the department will communicate the edits to the school divisions through a superintendent's memo. We will continue to develop and reflect on the edits by developing resources, working with, again, the Social Studies Leaders Consortium, and posting those resources on the DOE website, as well as GoOpenVA to share with all educators. Even though these are edits for history and social science, many of the resources can be used in other courses or even disciplines. And lastly, we are planning on providing a variety of professional development that will help teachers in schools and school divisions implement these changes. Next slide. So therefore, the Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends that the Board of Education approve the recommendations from the Governor's Commission on African American History Education in Virginia. At this time, the team and I will entertain any questions that you might have.
Let me just ask one. We got a decent amount of public comment on this. If you had a chance to review that public comment, there were some specific factual issues raised in some of the public comment. Have we, as the department, had a chance to vet those?
Specifically, there was one that came directly to me, and that was from Mr. Bromlick, and I did have an opportunity on Tuesday to speak with Mr. Bromlick, and his comments. I was able to reconnect with Dr. Ayers and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and I believe that comment, their response to his particular public comment was forwarded to Emily, if I'm not mistaken. None of what he has proposed would be incorporated right now, but would be considered for the review and revision process.
Okay. Are there
Anyone else would like to add to that? Okay.
I have
Ms. Holton?
President Gepker?
Yeah, Ms. Holton, then Dr. Mann?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Wilson also then?
Thank
Ms.
you.
Holton first?
Thank you, Christina. Very, very helpful. As I understand it, there are changes. Well, I don't completely understand it. So there are changes in three categories. One is the curriculum framework changes that we're making, revisions we're making immediately. One is a category of changes that will be considered as part of the ongoing standards and curriculum framework review, which you've provided the schedule for, and that's very helpful. And then this third, this item D, I think it is, attachment D, the lynching piece. Is that an actual change to the standard, or is that curriculum framework, or help me understand that one? And
yes,
why is that one different from the other two categories?
Yes, ma'am. That is a change to the standard. It's adding a substandard to VUS 0.8, which originally goes A through F. And we are proposing adding VUS 0.8G as an additional substandard. But if you do not want to do that, the content for lynching has been put into the curriculum frameworks now. The only difference is the recommendation that the committee proposed was the same content for the middle school course as it was for the high school course. So because that was a duplicate in the content that was being proposed, we are proposing to add a substandard to differentiate the content on lynching from middle school to high school. That's what you find in attachment D.
So if I understand correctly, sort of big picture, that
Mhm.
there was a standard that talked about the era of Reconstruction, but did not have anything in the standards specifically about lynching.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
the commission has recommended appropriately that there should be something about lynching in the standards. And so unlike with some of the other changes that are going to need to go through the longer process, where your recommendation, the recommendation that's before us is to accelerate a change to the standards to put the lynching piece in the standard itself now.
Yes, ma'am.
And it will also be in the curriculum framework and differentiate at different grades as appropriate.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that okay? Okay,
That is
great.
correct.
And Ms.
And
Moulton, if I
so,
can just add to that, maybe a way to conceptualize this in the simplest form is we're essentially asking you to adopt attachment A, which includes everything in the framework. And then once you've made the determination on option A, you have the option to consider whether you want to add to the standard. We wanted you to handle the framework first because that's what's in front of you. And knowing that the board may not want to adjust the standards because it's outside, we actually see that as a separate motion and a separate debate for the board. But the first debate is around framework, which is attachment A.
but are they both before us today?
Yes, they're both before you today, but the board gave us direction last month to only focus on the framework and change to the standards. And so we gave you an option to make one small change to the standards, but the framework attachment A is the main core recommendation.
I understand, but I sure think that the omission, the lack of any specific reference to lynching in the standards does seem like a matter of some urgency, and I would certainly be supportive of addressing it right away. And so as I understand it, if we address attachment D, that would be addressing one piece of the standards right now and that the rest of the standards would continue with the regular review process or the review process on the schedule that Christiania has outlined. And if I'm correct in understanding that so I hear you, there's two separate recommendations, the curriculum framework and then the standards revision. And then there are other changes that will continue to be considered over the course of the next year or so as we revisit both the standards and the curriculum framework. That sort of tripartite approach, have we shared that with the leadership of the commission and some of the other stakeholder groups? I'm thinking specifically some of the legislators that had reached out to us, and have we had any feedback? Are they comfortable with that approach, or did they have any suggestions?
The feedback that we received on attachment D came from the leaders of the standard subcommittee, and they were perfectly fine with the content of attachment D. I did go through the content that they proposed and then the content that is proposed in attachment D, and they were perfectly fine with that.
But then on the process, the overall approach of some changes now in the curriculum framework, this change in the standards potentially now, and then other things to be reviewed ongoing, that sort of approach overall, did they have any feedback on that?
No, ma'am.
But we're given an
And I can tell you,
opportunity.
Yes.
oh, yes, we spoke to the leadership with the team. In fact, I just got a text message from Leah. She spoke with the leadership as recently as Tuesday, and they were fine with the approach on the recommendations. And then we received a letter from the Legislative Black Caucus. Mr. Gecker and I both responded, with what we were doing. They have not necessarily responded back, so I wouldn't say that that's approval or denial in any way. But we've been in conversation with the Legislative Black Caucus as well.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Dr. Wilson, or I guess Dr. Mann, I'm sorry, and then Dr. Wilson.
Oh, no, that's fine. Actually, my question piggybacks on Mrs. Holton's question. And I think what's material for me in this is that you've articulated through your thoughtful presentation, thank you for that, that in fact, this content in attachment D shows up elsewhere. So it is not, it is different from the content that's flowing in attachment C that's going to be undertaken at a future date, but that this content already lives. So creating it as a sub bullet, a sub content area is not in effect creating new content outside of a process where you've already identified where other things are going to have to be handled down the line with the full on revision process. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
And Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, President Gecker. Thank you, Ms. Brown, for your presentation. I do have several questions that are actually related primarily to helping remind us about our typical process.
Okay.
So can you remind us how often is the framework revisited and changes recommended and or made in any other circumstance?
Well, this is unprecedented with the recommendations from the commission. The curriculum framework is reviewed and revised every 7 years, right after the standards document is approved by the board. In my tenure here at the department, I've never really encountered anything like this, where we have made changes to the curriculum framework outside of the revision process. So this is kind of unprecedented, but the curriculum framework for technical edits, since I've been in education, I believe for history and social science, I can speak to, there have been probably about 3 different instances where we've had to either update the curriculum framework because there have been changes, for example, with the changes of where you can register the vote. That was something through legislation, the curriculum framework had to be updated. So I've never really encountered, and maybe Michael or Shelley can speak to that happening in the past, but from my recollection, it's probably been about 3 or 4 times, and they were very small. We've not had changes like this since I've been at the department.
But we have had changes.
We have had changes, yes, ma'am.
So that's one question. Second question is, you mentioned the number of shifts and changes and the reorganization and putting things in different places. So I think about our teachers,
yes,
who are working with the revisions, and confusion, potential confusion. I heard you talk about professional development and the resources that will be available. So can you expand a little bit on when we expect resources to be available to our teachers, and how we would anticipate helping them manage through and understand. I understand you're meeting, I think you said next week, with leaders in content. So can you talk a little bit about how we are going about supporting teachers who will be asked to implement or given this resource really for their use?
As again, in speaking with the social studies leaders next week, many of them are right on board, and they're working with their teams right now to revise their local curriculum. We are anticipating having something posted for teachers by the beginning of the next calendar year to give us enough time to gather those resources and also vet those resources. We're looking for specialists to develop activities that'll go along with those resources. So that may take some time. School divisions will be encouraged to incorporate this new content into their local curriculum now, even though school has started, but it will be an expectation that the 2021-2022 school year that is fully implemented into their local curriculum, the changes, knowing that we're kind of starting late in a sense that school has already started and courses have already started with content, and some of the content that was added had to do with, for example, the arrival of the first Africans to British North America. For many courses, they've moved past that standard. So rather than trying to get them to go back and reteach, it's understandable that they just can't do that. And also they would need resources to help them with that. So second semester, there are quite a few standards where changes have been made that they can teach this content starting with the second semester, but we're definitely encouraging them to look at the changes now and incorporate it into their local curriculum. But it will be the expectation that starting with the full next school year, that they have made those changes to their local curriculum and are incorporating it into their instructional plan.
Okay, so the key dates I heard you say was January 2021, resources identified and in place, and then implementation beginning in the full implementation, the 21-22 academic year.
Yes, ma'am.
Great, thank you. Mr. Gecker, those are all of my questions.
Okay, Dr. Duran.
First, I want to thank you and the members of the commission for putting this work forward. I think it's so exciting and to finally have us acknowledge, first of all, and second of all, actually put into some practice the notion that our history needs to be told for all. Mm-hmm. And everyone's history needs to be told. So I'm very, very thankful for that and seeing this progress moving in that way. I wanted to follow, Dr. Wilson actually took the one question I had, so I'll just follow up a little bit on that in terms of the supports that will be put in place and the resources. Mm-hmm. Because having said what I just said, most of the resources that we have in school divisions are not tailored or written or in any way close, actually contrary in some cases, telling a different story quite implicitly at times. So help me to understand what are some of the things that we might be able to do to help either encourage, maybe not encourage, but to help bring together more of those resources for school divisions or awareness of what those are. Mm-hmm. I understand that, maybe providing them, and we want to give each school division and we want to give our teachers the ability to choose from resources and things that are appropriate. But I do think we need to think of having some that are recommended, because this is not an area that a lot of leaders and staff and teachers know about where good resources are. Right. This is a new developing form of acknowledgement, I would say, at least amongst the school systems as a large. So I think we're going to need more than just, here's the new curriculum, here's some guidance, here's some support, here's some direction. We're going to need to say, here are some good resources you should look into. And I really encourage us to do that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. But because it's great that we're doing this, but I worry if we don't add that additional component to it, then it's going to be for naught, because well-intended and what school divisions are going to want to implement this, but without the knowledge and the awareness to be able to shift towards this new history that needs to be taught, then I think that we will be potentially still struggling to ensure that all students, and this is for all students too. I read some comments and heard some feedback that was not very positive about why are we teaching African American history to students who aren't African American, and why are we trying to change our history and tell people a whole different one. Well, this is for all students. This is not just for African American students. African American history is everyone's history. Mm-hmm. And that whole narrative and that thought process is what I'm worried about if we don't have some additional resources to provide.
Well, the first, we'll start with the recommendations from the commission. And we had that list in the presentation at the September 17th meeting. Another resource that we started with when we first started to develop the African American history elective course in working with WHRO, and they've created about 6 or 7 different playlists that are categorized by different content. And those items, I think they call them artifacts, within their playlists vary from full-blown lessons to videos that can span a couple of minutes to almost an hour. Some of them are lectures from different professors. It might be a lecture series, or it might be a snippet from a documentary where it is appropriate from K-12. So that playlist is a really good recommendation. As a matter of fact, when they were putting it together, they asked the department, our staff, if we could give them several topics to where they could take everything that had to do with African American history within their catalog and kind of categorize them under those different topics. And it just so happens that many of those topics are reflected in the changes that have been made to the curriculum frameworks. So we'll start there. We've spoken last week with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and they have offered to also curate some resources for us also that we can put into this chart. So we have a lot of different museums and organizations that are recommending, and then we will go through those recommendations to say, this is what you really need to incorporate into your local curriculum, or when you're teaching this particular content, this is where you may want to have your teachers gain their background knowledge. Because like you said, teachers may be unfamiliar with the content that we've added. So we want to put something in place, not just for their instruction, but also for building their capacity, their content capacity also. That's going to be very important. We also will need to reach out to the media specialists, in a sense that looking at what they have available in their library and media centers to support the changes that we have in the curriculum frameworks. And I don't know if Christine or Holly, Michael, or Dr. Lane would like to add to that. Don't everybody talk at once.
President Gecker.
Yes, Ms. Davis-Vaught.
Ms. Brown, thank you very much for your thorough presentation, and thank you, colleagues, for asking those questions and clarifying. I am waiting to hear about the professional development piece for our teachers so that they can catch up to this full implementation by 2022. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Some of the professional development that we are considering and also doing, we've outlined, incorporated it into that projected timeline. Some of it will deal with cultural relevant practices. We are right now working with VCU for our teachers for the African American history course, and recording those sessions and making them available. They'll be available on the DOE website and also through Go Open. It's very difficult, I think, for teachers right now with teaching virtually or in hybrid situations, or even going back face to face, to come out of that day and then join a live session, professional development session. So we're trying to record as many of those as possible. During the month of August, we started a series of teaching hard history, and we offered those sessions every Thursday from 3:30 to 5. And all of those sessions have been recorded, and they are posted on our YouTube channel also, so that we can put those particular recordings into this chart to point teachers towards helping them incorporate the changes into their local curriculum, and hopefully begin if not earlier, no later than the beginning of the new school year. So much of the professional development that we're offering is live, but it will also be recorded so that teachers, when they have time in their schedules, they will be able to attend or review those sessions. So it's kind of twofold in a sense, where we're offering live sessions, but also recording so that they can begin to expand their toolbox, not only instructionally, but also building their own background knowledge. Christine?
I was just going to add in the timeline. We've added webinars that will begin in November, and they're targeted by course as well as by educators, from teachers to administrators, to go over the changes in the curriculum framework, so that we're targeting what they need by level. So if it's for the kindergarten grade levels or the Virginia studies, as well as for administrators versus a teacher, just going over those changes. So that begins in November, according to our timeline with the webinars.
And I also want to add that we have begun working with Jean Weller. We have another advisory committee that will be starting in November. It was legislated by HB 916, and it specifically looks at culturally relevant and inclusive practices. We received a lot of applications for that particular committee, and many of them were teachers. I want to say that probably about 40 to 50% of the applicants were teachers. So we decided, in working with the Equity Office, we decided to pull that group out as a teacher advisory committee, because many of the applicants stressed their experience with culturally relevant teaching practices. So we wanted to pull a group from that application pool to work as a cohort to develop resources and professional development. We will start them at the same time that we start this committee, but it will be a separate working group so that they can look at not just history and social science, because a part of the legislation is that they review the standards, but we wanted this particular group to think about culturally relevant teaching practices for not only our discipline, but all disciplines. Leah, did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to add that Kristania is doing so much work in this space that she's probably not remembering every single detail of everything she's doing. But in addition to what she's already mentioned, that same group of teacher cohort that are currently going through the PD we're offering related to the African American elective course are also charged and tasked with producing resource materials to support the successful delivery of instruction for that course content. And the way the project's been designed, much of the work that they're developing will be added into Go Open and be provided to the broader field to support the successful instruction of these new edits and the new content that's been added to the curriculum frameworks.
Thank you. Totally forgot about them.
Ms. Holton?
President, go ahead, Ann.
I defer to Dr. Mann, and then I would love
just
to
really quickly, as I'm listening to the focus on professional development, it just came to me that maybe it'd be interesting to think about how we're also going to be equipping and supporting leaders to deal more with the emotional side of what it means to teach this content. I think certainly the information is there, and you're expecting that people are going to engage, but I think we can't underestimate what it really means to truly confront dealing with telling history as it is when people have, maybe are not going to be warm to that. And so how do we create communities of support from a principal leadership, or just trying to have a pulse on what schools are doing where they may be running into some challenge or resistance around incorporating, the content. And I'm sure you all are thinking about that, but I just from the angle of knowing what it really takes to do and live this work, the kind of support that is needed outside of just where's the content to help us teach is important. And I'm sure y'all are thinking about that, but I just wanted to give an explicit call out to it because it is very different from, the idea of what are the practices.
Great.
We actually have something we're planning specifically for school leaders and division level leaders for this fall that will focus really intentionally around culturally responsive pedagogy, culture and climate around cultural responsiveness and cultural relevancy, in particular related to these new standards this new content once it is approved by the board, if it's successfully approved today. And so we have a plan and a strategy for that for this fall, where we'll be hosting a very large convening for school level leaders and as well as division level leaders specifically related to that, Dr. Mann.
Great, thank you.
Leah, it may also be good for you to talk about the Ed Equity webinar series that you have and the engagements that you do with equity leaders, because we're identifying point people in every school division to lead equity, and they will often be the person that can help with principals in their home communities, one-on-one, superintendents. And Leah, maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks, Dr. Lane. So we have launched what we call the Ed Equity VA webinar series, where we are hosting at a minimum about 2 webinars a month that are specifically focused on different components of advancing equity outcomes in schools. So we are focused on both culture, climate, leadership principles. What does it take to be a courageous leader? We've done some partnership work with VCU School of Education, where they're doing a lot of statewide leadership in this space, particularly around the principles of anti-racism in education settings. And so that webinar series, we relaunched in February, and we typically have over 500 registrants per session that we hold and around 300 participants for each session. All of those sessions are recorded and posted on our websites, and we mail them out to everyone on our mailing list also so that they can access that information and content at any time. We're looking at hosting a much larger convening, just again, honing in on some really specific topics that we know are of interest to the broader education stakeholder community. And then we also launched a community of practice with all of the local equity leads across the state. We meet with them every 2 weeks. In a virtual setting. And then we also have created a digital platform community of practice where they can exchange ideas and practices and start working in more regional ways on issues that are presenting themselves, that are specific to a region. So we definitely have the infrastructure in place to support, I think, really intentional professional development and professional learning opportunities around this topic and some of our much broader equity topics that we're focusing on as an agency. And then we are also having our conversation with UVA Center for Public Education and Race and Public Education in the South. And they are gearing up to actually be positioned to provide they're calling it continuing education units or something like that, specifically related to being able to adequately teach African-American history content based on the recommendations that were put forward by the African-American History Education Commission. So they're already gearing up to have a PD in place for teachers who are seeking more information on the actual content to increase their knowledge base.
Great, thank you.
And I think Leah's comment really is a good reminder that whereas we're talking a lot about the professional development we're doing right now to be responsive to the potential vote that you're going to take, there is a whole long-term strategy, if you recall, from the commission's work to revise professional development in a broader way around this area. And so whereas you're focusing on the standard recommendations, there will be a future date where we'll come back whether that comes from the General Assembly or directly to the board will remain to be seen, but where we'll actually handle their professional development recommendations for the long term as well, which are a really important piece of their work that is complementary to the standards review that you're doing today.
Thank you.
Sultan, did you still have a comment?
Yes, thank you. Looking at the timeline, you know, I know the process for our regular process for reviewing the standards and framework is a complex and involved and long one, I see, with work beginning already, but being finalized late in 22. I believe I understand the timeline correctly, that the matter is not formally brought back before the board until the summer of 22 for when the standards are brought, the new draft of the standards and curriculum framework are brought to us for first review. And that's probably what we typically do, but I will say that my experiences, I sometimes feel like we're brought into the loop fairly late in the game. And if there could be an opportunity, and I know that's because there's a lot of work that needs to be done before you've got product to share with us. But if we could be brought up to speed sometime in 21 and have the opportunity to engage and offer our feedback as the process goes forward before you bring an actual document to us for first review, that might be helpful to us all.
Okay.
And might be helpful to the final approval.
Okay, well, we're officially bringing a timeline to you, I believe in a report in January. So what we can do is go back through the timeline that's presented and projected timeline that's presented in attachment E and look for some space to do just that.
Thank you.
Okay, let me ask one last question. As you go through the SOL review, is that the standards review, do you also do a parallel review of the framework?
This projected timeline will put them side by side so that we have one document instead of two. Previously, in the past review for the 2015 standards, we went through the whole process just for the standards and then made adjustments to the curriculum framework so that the curriculum framework document aligned to the standards. What is being proposed in attachment E is that takes place simultaneously so that there's not an adjustment a year later for the curriculum framework, but as we're developing the standards, that we develop the curriculum framework content at the same time.
So the curriculum framework will be harmonized to the standards as you go through.
Yes.
Mr. Gecker, this is probably a good time for me to interject a second. And one of the things that I have found at the department, and this is a much longer conversation that we hope to have with the board in a future month, but I think it will answer your question. One of the things that I have found is that when our standards are reviewed by national conglomerates and other entities, our standards are often found to be lacking in some content. And then our response is generally, well, if you look in the framework, we address it in the framework. And you can't just look at our standards alone. You have to look at the standards and the framework. We've been having a lot of conversation as a team, and we think that the history standards review will be a process that we will bring to you as we go through this timeline. But our thinking right now is to not have separate standards and frameworks anymore, and just to incorporate the frameworks into the standards so it's one big set. You know, it used to be that the board adopted the standards, the department did frameworks, but we described to you last month that really the board set a precedent that you do the frameworks as well. And so our thinking is that we will not have separate documents that, you know, it's a lot to ask someone besides a teacher, but a parent, a citizen, to look at our standards and then go look at some other documents. We really want to know what we're teaching. We really feel like it's more transparent to have it all in one place. We're going to ask you for permission to do that later, but I think that will partly address your concern that we'll have two separate processes where really we think we need in all standard areas one set of documents so that when anyone reviews our standards, they see everything that kids are learning in our classrooms.
Actually, that was not my concern, James. It was, I guess, couple-fold. You know, we're revising the standard, the framework, which is fine, which is sort of the more detailed version of what we're teaching. However, we're doing that on a fairly quick basis, right? I mean, it's the timeline from proposal to adoption is going to be pretty short relative to what it's been in the past. Then we're going to go through at the standards next year, or the department is, and but in the meantime, we're going to be developing all this material for the field. And what if, as you go through the standards, the framework basically changes some? And we've done a lot of work this year or now that is going to be rendered, just incorrect or not appropriate, or wrong words being used here, but not in concert with whatever we come up with next year it is we want to teach. And, I understand and actually approve of the desire to move the framework changes through now, but I guess, and again, this is probably just an example of somebody outside the field not understanding exactly how the pieces fit together. But it seems to me that to do PD around, or a significant amount of work today around a framework that might actually change some is wasteful is the wrong word, because I don't think this is a waste, but it is concerning to me in terms of process. And just want some comfort that we believe that what we're doing today is not going to be changed as you go through the standards review with a more full process, which is one of the reasons, honestly, I asked about, had the department had a chance to review all the public comment, the specific comments made with regard to factual issues that are being, put forward today. I just don't want to see it done and then undone. Dr. Wilson?
So yeah, Mr. Gecker, thank you. Said a different way from my vantage point is, and it's the paradigm I think that perhaps many of us have operated under, that the standards drive the framework.
Yeah.
Whereas in this process, it could feel like the framework will drive the standards. And so to be very clear about, and James, Dr. Lane, I appreciate the idea that incorporating the two together is likely where we want to head, but thinking about what is driving what's the lead, right? And so for me, as the standards are being reviewed, being open, I suppose, that the framework itself, though we may approve revisions today, that there may be further revision to the revision based on, so just being very much open to a full process that will allow for the best set of documents, whatever we call them and whatever is contained in them, so that our students will learn the fullest or be exposed to the fullest history that they can, and that our teachers, our leaders, have the resources available to them. So Mr. Gecker, I concur with your concern, and would frame, for me, that the frame that I've just described is how I've been thinking about it.
I appreciate your translating for me. That's very
Yeah,
helpful.
and
I take it that we're also, at this point, even though we're going to put this in the framework, the assessments will not change.
so yeah, the assessments will not change until the 2022 revision, because we've already developed the 2015 assessments. And then I just want, Mr. Gecker, you've asked this a couple of times, so I just want to make sure I said it plainly. Yes, the department reviewed all of the public comment. I read it myself. I considered it, and it didn't change my recommendation, though it does inform me as I think forward to the main standards revision in 22. And I would also say, I would guarantee that there will be some changes between what you do now and 2022, because certainly recommendations that we're asking you to consider later, but there's also, and we've talked to you some about this in the past, a movement to a more thematic history than only a chronological history. And I think that that will bring another level of depth that will be really appreciated. So I see this as a step to where we want to go rather than a diversion to where we want to go. It's clearly on the pathway, but I think we'll continue to develop the standards to make them even better in 2022. And I believe that any work we do now will be beneficial in the 2022 revision.
So, thank you, James, by the way, and I appreciate the direct answer to the question.
And I'll just chime in to say, it is a dilemma whether to go fast or to go carefully, but recognizing that our normal process, even expedited by combining curriculum framework and standard review, it is a 2-year process. So starting now, those changes won't be finalized until late 22 and then won't really be available and implemented in the schools until the following school year. So we're talking 3 years from now. And I agree with the sense of urgency from the commission, and I know you all do too, that for instance, something like lynching being missing from the standards, you know, that there's 3 years is too long to wait. 3 years worth of students coming through the system. I think it is appropriate to do what we can on a more urgent basis now, even if that does disrupt the normal process.
President Gecker, on that point Ms. Holton made, I just wanted to say, as Dr. Lane, I listened to you talk about the process and the opportunity to combine. And I guess what this moment makes me think about is that, you know, whatever process is reimagined, there needs to always be space for change. That we can't predict or know what's going to happen in any dimension of how we think about what it means for children to be educated. And so I think it's important to ensure that if frameworks are brought together with curriculum, with the standards, that it doesn't get in the way when you consider, you know, there could be a 10-year process where you're living with the reality of 7 years, living with the reality of standards that a moment in history may turn on its end. And I feel like there has to be incorporated in how this gets reimagined, an opportunity for that to be honored, right? And so I wanted to share that, because these are massive undertakings. And when they're in place for a significant period, given everything that flows into them from assessments and so forth. But a process must not be so rigid and fixed that we can't intervene if history requires it.
Okay. I want to make clear that was not my suggestion.
No, but I wanted to say out loud, that's what you know,
okay.
I'm appreciating that the desire to make things efficient and come together so it's not so overwhelming. It is a lot for people to digest and appreciate how these things all work together. But I do perceive that this standalone opportunity with a framework allows you some flexibility to make edits and deal with change that doesn't disrupt your process on standards if that needs to be fixed and set. So
yeah, I will say I have no problem with the content. I have, and again, this is probably my lack of experience in the education industry. I am constantly concerned about how what we do here gets translated into the field. You know, my goal, and I think the board's goal, is to educate our children in the best way possible. And what that means is, in part, giving clear guidance to those people who are teaching our children, you know, what is supposed to happen in the classroom. And so, you know, I worry a little bit, again, not about this content, but about a process that allows for rapid shifts in our expectations in the field. I mean, because, you know, as aware as we may be of the need to make changes in what we have, what we do is only as good as how it gets communicated in the classroom, right? We're not doing this for the adults, we're doing this for the kids. You know, this is not about, frankly, responding positively or negatively to the African American History Education Commission or the politicians who write to us. This is about how do we translate what we believe ought to be taught in our schools into the classroom so that our children get the best education possible and the education we believe they ought to have. And so when I ask questions about process, it is really completely divorced from the content. It is really geared to, helping me understand better what the impact of our action is on the product we're looking to produce, which is, educated children. And so the comments ought not be read any other way than that. And I will honestly say I still have, some concerns about how this plays in the field, which I don't think is any different from the concerns that have been expressed by the professional education community. But again, it is not a concern over content. And the process is only as good as, again, what it translates to. Do we achieve the result we're looking to achieve? And, I'm hopeful, and after having listened to James and Christania, that, we will figure out a way to have, and to Leah, we'll figure out a way to have this translated appropriately into the classroom. For us to do stuff on our own just is meaningless to me, unless again, it changes classroom behavior. And so, and kid outcome. Anyway, Dr. Duran.
I thank you for those comments and from further clarification. And I just want to add, I think that in this case too, there are actions that we take that cannot be divorced from what the field is and the shift that would occur. But in this case, I think the actions of having a curriculum on history and social studies overall that does not acknowledge a group of students and their own history also sends a message to those in the field to not teach. And sometimes, and I'll be frank, I've heard many people use that as an excuse. Well, it's not in the standards, it's not in the framework, it's not, and so I don't need to teach that. You're asking me to do something that's not even required by VDOE or by the state. I've heard that many times. And so
we find superintendents like you, Francisco, who make the teachers and the principals do what it is they're supposed to do.
Right, but I think from the board level, from our responsibility we have as state board members is to really be thoughtful, to your point, and to not do things in absence because we think or feel it's the best thing or it's the latest comment we've received. But we also have to ground that in the reality of when we see and when we know that students are not being taught and recognized in their own lessons. They're not being valued. They're not seeing themselves in the curriculum. And when we see that, then there are going to be some major shifts that we need to put in place. And the question that many of us are asking, that you were also, the professional development, the resources, we can't just tell teachers and school divisions, this is not happening, it needs to happen, period. No. That's why I asked about what resources can we put in place, and Dr. Wilson about supporting teachers, Dr. Mann, several of us, because that concern, and you, I'm sure, had that same exact concern about just mandating or dictating something from here that we think is best to do, or the right thing to do. Even sometimes the right thing to do isn't what you have, the way you do the right thing isn't always the right way, right? So we have to be thoughtful about that. But for me, this is an area where I think we all have to make that shift quickly as possible with full support, because too many students are not seeing themselves in the curriculum. And then too many other students are, as a result of that, defining and stereotyping and stigmatizing our African-American students in a way that doesn't value and honor them and their contributions to our history. And so I appreciated hearing what you say, because it reminds me, and it should remind all of us, we need to be thoughtful about how we proceed with things, and we need to be mindful of that. But I also want to just balance that with all of us remembering that we have to think about what our students are experiencing. And I'm not saying you weren't, but I'm saying that overall, as we go through major changes like this, that has to be a forefront. At least for me, I lead with how are our students experiencing their education? Are they really receiving one that really values them? And I do believe that not being included in the curriculum is a message to them that they're not valued.
I concur with that, Francisco. I think that's exactly right. It is a message. I spent, rarely talk about personal things. I spent yesterday in traffic court with one of my daughters. And, there were, out of all the defendants, there were 2 white defendants. And, my, daughter looked at me and said, looked around the room and said, this is the problem. And it's no different in our schools in the same way. It is clear that we have got to do something different. So no, I live it every day, Francisco. In any event, Kristania, any further words of wisdom before we take this to a vote?
I have none.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your patience.
Thank you for all of your comments. I really appreciate that. We really appreciate that.
Okay. Is there a motion on item H to approve, I guess it's attachment A first, as changes to the curriculum framework?
So moved, President Gecker.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. I don't see any further discussion, so we'll do a roll call vote. Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
And Dr. Mann?
Aye.
And I vote aye. And then, is there a motion? We did not discuss this at length, but I think we've covered the topic for attachment D, which would be the additional standards. Do I have this right, Kristania?
The additional substandard, yes, sir.
Substandard, excuse me. Actually, I'm looking at the title. It says standard for consideration, but I'll revise it in my mind to substandard.
Okay.
All right, is there a motion to adopt essentially the substandard, which just sounds wrong to say, on attachment D?
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Davis-Vaught. Again, by roll call, Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
Dr. Mann?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody who participated in that discussion.
Thank you.
All right, item I.
Thank you, Kristania.
Item I.
Sorry, Mr. Gecker. I just had to say a special thank you to Kristania. She's worked so hard on this, and I just congrats, Kristania, on wrapping that. I'm heading to the harder work, which is the next phase, and Leah and everyone and the commission members. Sorry, just had to. Thank you.
Yes, yay. Thank you.
All right.
Have a great afternoon.
Kristania, let me celebrate you then once from the chair. Congratulations. This has been awesome. The next person who hijacks my meeting, however, Emily, please mute them.
Thanks, Dr. Gecker. Have a good one.
Thank you. All right. Item I, final review of a process to certify a list of qualified persons for the Office of Division Superintendents of Schools. Ms. Pitts.
Good morning, President Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. It is a pleasure for me this morning to present this item to you. At your last meeting, we went over this matter in detail, but I will quickly recap. The Constitution of Virginia requires the Board of Education to certify to the school board of each division a list of qualified persons for the Office of Division Superintendent of Schools. Prior to 1993, Virginia did not issue a division superintendent license. Prior to that time, a list of individuals who were eligible for appointment was presented to the Board of Education each month. In 1993, however, a division superintendent license was established, and no longer was a list of eligible individuals sent to the Board of Education for certification. In order to meet this constitutional requirement, however, the following procedure is proposed for you today. Initially, the board will certify a list of the names of the individuals who currently hold a division superintendent license. So you will receive the entire list. Subsequently, new applications will be reviewed to ensure that they meet the Board of Education requirements, and the names of those individuals will be presented to the Board of Education for certification. And upon board certification, then the division superintendent license would be issued. During the last meeting, you asked that I reach out to the Virginia School Boards Association to inquire how this new process may impact its work in assisting school boards to appoint superintendents. I talked to the executive director, Gina Patterson, and she conveyed to me two concerns. The first, which is her primary concern, is timing. The Board of Education does not meet every month. In our current environment, when a school board, sometimes an individual, or a search company communicates with me that a school board is making a decision and needs the person to have the division superintendent license, we accommodate that schedule. It's not unusual for me to receive the credentials overnight, process them that day, issue the division superintendent license so a school board can make its announcement within the next day or a matter of a week. That is really not uncommon for us. So she's very concerned about that timing issue, as well as the issue of confidentiality. But let me explain. All of you know that if one has a division superintendent license or any license, that's public information. We have a public query on our webpage that one can put in a name and see whether someone has been issued a license. Her concern, which is certainly less than the timing issue, but one that may be expressed by applicants, is that both out-of-state and in-state applicants sometimes wait until they are in the final candidate pool before they apply for the division superintendent license or until they've been selected. Her concern, and again, it is less than the timing, is that when individuals apply and their names are submitted to the board, those names are more prominent. So it could prompt more questions from employers. For example, if I was applying for a division superintendency and my name was on this list for certification, there could be questions from a current employer. Oh, are you applying for other employment? But again, the basic and the major question, concern that she has is with the whole timing issue, and that it could take up to 2 or 3 months before a school board could appoint the candidate of its choice, because the individual's name must be certified by the board. But we certainly understand to the constitutional duty of the Board of Education. And as such, the Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends that the Board of Education approve the process to certify a list of qualified persons for the office of Division Superintendent of Schools. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions from board members? Ms. Holton?
Thank you, Ms. Pitts, for sharing what we're trying to do and the concerns. And I had a brief conversation with Dr. Lane about this as well earlier this morning. I am concerned about the VSBA objections, and we also did get a letter from the VSBA in the public comment that came in last night that reiterated the same two positions that you raised today. If I understand it correctly, this is a system that basically is working, but we're trying to make sure we are complying with the constitutional legal requirement. That's the instigation for change here. And I guess I don't know what the legal fix is, but I have enough faith in good lawyering that I'm convinced we ought to be able to find a solution that meets the constitutional legal requirement without setting us back on a process that's basically working for helping school boards find their next superintendents. I don't want the board to give up its authority over this, because there may be occasions when we need to exercise it. But I'm just worried that, that we haven't yet come up with a solution that answers the two objections you raised. And it's hard to find good superintendents these days. This is one of the toughest, it is the toughest job in education. I'm convinced. It's not surprising that we have rapid turnover. It's not surprising that it's hard for school boards to hire good superintendents. And I just hate to put any extra obstacles in the way. So my question is it worth taking a little more time to try to work with lawyers and the School Board Association, and maybe bring in the Superintendents Association and see if leave no stone unturned to find a solution that satisfies the constitutional requirement, but doesn't, but that also somehow addresses these concerns. And I don't know what the solution is. I'm just wondering, have we turned over all the stones and this is the best we can do, or is it worth taking a little more time and see if we can improve upon it?
Ms. Holton, we did look at alternatives, such as whether it would be possible for the board to, by resolution, to give that authority to Dr. Lane as the superintendent of public instruction. However, we did consult with counsel, and that did not seem to be a viable avenue. And certainly if Susan Williams wants to add to this answer, it may be more appropriate coming from her.
Hi, this is Susan Williams. Yes, we did look at every stone. And it's because it is a constitutional authority and responsibility of the Board of Education, it's not something that can be delegated to Dr. Lane or to the Department of Education. I mean, there were other alternatives that we did consider, and Patty, you probably be a better one to discuss the pros and cons of these, but under the current system, if you continue to issue a superintendent's license and then have it ratified later by the board, but that has some problems too. And
so Susan, may I ask, can I ask the process question? Have you had the opportunity to sit down with VAS and or VSBA and just brainstorm? Is there a way, get your creativity juices going. That's what good lawyers do, right? And figure out a way that meets their needs, but also meets our constitutional obligations. And then maybe you all have done that already and we've come up with the best we can do.
I have not brainstormed with the associations, no.
And I don't think they have, I don't know if they have access to legal counsel, but I just wonder whether it's worth taking a little more time. Dr. Duran has been through this process recently. I think I see him waving.
Well, I was just going to say this, I wanted to echo your comments, Ms. Holton, and see if there was, well, first of all, to understand, I think you remember I brought this up at the last time in the first review about the concern of the timing. So I did want to understand if we had gone through all potential options completely and this literally was the only one, or if not, there were other ways to pause on this and look a little further before we had to approve this. So you did ask my questions. I still, maybe Susan would like to hear a little bit more clarity. Do you think there's an opportunity to go and look at this one more time with some associations, et cetera?
Sure.
Or I just feel uncomfortable at this time trying to move forward without knowing that for sure. And I get that it's a constitutional requirement, so I understand that, but I don't feel too comfortable moving forward as one board member on this because of all the complexities and that I know it will cause. If there's no other choice, and you're saying there's no other choice and it's required, that's one thing, but I would love to hear from you, Susan, that that's the case, or if not, that there could be some more consideration.
I have certainly looked into this in great in great detail, but like I said, I mean, the only other choice that we came up with that was discussed was that continue the process that the department does right now. So Patty, issues the superintendent's license. The only problem with that is that it would have to be after you kind of be doing things in reverse order. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying that it would be a matter of Patty issuing the license, and then at the next board meeting, that person's name would be on the list. The problem there would be if somebody, and I cannot even give you a hypothetical that would be likely, but the only problem with that approach would be if the person was issued a superintendent's license, got a job based on it, or got the promise of a job, I should say, based on it, and then the board at the next meeting didn't include them on the list of eligibles. Then the school division wouldn't be able to hire them. And I would ask Patty to speak up, some of because we have been back and forth through this, some of the process part, because some of this is process and not a legal issue.
Correct. I do have concerns about issuing a division superintendent license that then has to be certified by the board. Once a person has a license, one thinks he or she can do what that license prescribes it to do. For example, be appointed as a division superintendent. Once you have a teaching license, you can teach. Once you have a driver's license, you can drive. I think that giving someone a license and then having it certified, they still need to wait until the certification has been completed to be appointed a division superintendent. So we found that process to be complicated and confusing, whereas what we are proposing would be more straightforward. And, as we said, we have really discussed this process, certainly can discuss it again with the association and its attorney. But the proposal that we have before you today appears to be, at this point, the best solution. But again, if you want us to go back to the association and it does have its own attorney, then we can certainly do that.
Thank you, Patty and Susan. I, as one board member, I would like that, but I'll have to hear from my colleagues to see how they feel. But as one person, I would feel more comfortable with that.
Dr. Wilson?
Thank you. Patty, one thing you just said, the complexity or the added layer or perhaps confusion on issuing a license before certification by the board, is that process feels a lot like what local school divisions do. For example, when they issue a contract or make an offer to a teacher, outside of the process of their local boards meeting. The language, I think, says something like contingent upon approval by the local board. So I'm not certain if there are different complexities in this scenario that we're talking about with division superintendents compared to what happens at a local level. Can you help me understand the difference there?
I think the difference is that if a school board is negotiating with an individual who it wishes to employ or appoint, I think at that point, they do have conversations even now to say that we are very interested in appointing you as superintendent. However, you do not have a division superintendent license. Once you receive that, then the appointment can be made. So I think that's pretty analogous to a school division. They might even give them a letter saying that you are the candidate of choice if these particular criteria have been met. But the concern is that if we actually issue the license itself, I think because since 1993, that's what we've been doing. And once you have that, you are on what we call an eligible list of division superintendents, which we're required by statute to maintain. We issue that list to school boards that are interested in employing individuals. It's a public list if it's requested. I do think that it becomes more problematic if we give that license. And what if an individual takes that license and goes to another state issues that person a division superintendent license based upon our license, and it really hasn't been vetted or certified as stated in the Constitution? I do think that could be problematic for individuals. We don't want someone to move from one job to another on the basis of having a division superintendent license that has not gone through the full process to be certified.
Again, I guess, Pat, I distinguish in my mind between having the qualifications to be a superintendent, which is what the license does, and being eligible to be hired. You know, we gave teachers licenses to people who had, you know, felonies. And then we had a statute that said, you know, school division couldn't hire them, but that didn't make them any less having a teacher's license, right? All this, so I'm not sure about the confusion piece either. I mean, we made it through those times. Well, I mean, why wouldn't the license just indicate meeting the base criteria to be a superintendent? I mean, and again, remembering the history of this provision, it was the change from the state appointing all division superintendents to having the locals essentially being picked from a list approved by the board. Whereas, again, they can have the, I'm missing the harm of having the superintendent's license and being able to go elsewhere and say, I have a superintendent's license.
I will say, even from our experience with individuals who hold licenses who have felony convictions, who have been limited on employment opportunities based upon that felony conviction, it has caused confusion with school divisions about those people's employability because they have the license. Certainly, we could do more education. We could make things clearer. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but I would say that it is not as straightforward as once you receive a license, then you're eligible to serve in that particular position. But certainly we can review this again and come back to the board with another look, after another look.
President Gecker, I mean, as I listen to this, it makes me sort of wonder, and you started to talk about historically why we're here. And, you know, I listen to this because if you get a license, you should be able to do the job. And the certification, I do understand that the board is charged with sort of protecting the integrity of public education in the Commonwealth. But this feels like one of those moments where there is an added step that creates complexity that I don't really understand, because in the world of private employment, the idea of people being able to confidentially pursue things, it feels very not in keeping with securing the best talent, if you will, in ways that it feels like an element of bureaucracy that is controlling more than and I know we don't change the Constitution every day. And I know we can't like put that up as like, let's go for the Constitution today to deal with the problem. But it feels like one of those moments as I'm trying to parse out, why are we doing it in this way if we want to operate in ways that positions the Commonwealth to secure the best possible talent for these very challenging jobs? I'm struggling.
Well, let me talk about it from a different way then, because what we have effectively done since the 90s, I guess it is, when we started doing, you know, superintendent's licenses, is we delegated effectively our responsibility under the Constitution to staff. And so it's not that now nobody is checking for are people qualified to do it, to protect it. It's that now staff is doing it exclusively instead of the board doing it. And we had a circumstance fairly recently that James was involved with where a division wanted to hire somebody locally who didn't meet the criteria. And essentially it was staff who ended up making that call instead of the board. So we're not actually adding a layer of bureaucracy in a sense. What we're doing is we're saying that this is a responsibility we are not entitled to delegate fully. And in fact, here, what we're saying is, because I cannot imagine a circumstance where we would take the work of staff, look underneath it and say, you know, if staff recommends or says this person has got the requisite qualifications, the board, I just can't imagine a circumstance where we would say, no, they don't.
Right.
That's just not going to happen. But on the other hand, it is a non-delegable duty that we have. And in this era of originalist constitutional interpretation that we're going to go through soon, we don't have an option. I mean, it could be argued that every superintendent out there today who has not gone through board certification could not have been hired legally by these divisions. As crazy as that seems, I mean, we veered away from a process that, because I guess pre-division or superintendent licenses, the board was doing it, right?
Correct.
We veered away, and maybe we shouldn't have, but I'm happy to defer this item to see if there is a different fix that impacts timing. I am, but I don't see how we legitimately now can say this is not a board responsibility. I mean, it's an express mandate.
Well, that's helpful. I appreciate that. I didn't have the history on how we got there, but I still, I mean, there's a piece of me when you think about the frequency of when the board meets, all of the board responsibilities, whether that belongs here. And if there is and I know it's the Constitution right now, we have to do, but
I will say the frequency argument does not sit with me as well, honestly, as the confidentiality argument. Because on the frequency piece, superintendent searches go on for periods of months.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see them doing it in 4 weeks, in 3 weeks. There is a process that people go through that it's inconceivable to me that we wouldn't have during the course of that process a meeting at which somebody could be approved on that list. I just don't see that as realistic. Even, the divisions we've been involved with recently, we had knowledge of the candidates, some of the candidates, with regard to the divisions under MOU, where we've been involved in that some. We know. And I mean, the bigger issue to me is you have folks from out of state, for example, who would not normally have a Virginia license. And we've had, James, has that all been announced yet down? I mean, we can talk about have they been hired yet? The last MOU?
That is not official.
Okay, so forget that one, but we can talk about Petersburg, right? Where Dr. Petrie Martin came from outside the state. She would have been much more disadvantaged, not by the timing issue, but by the confidentiality issue. Because she was in that process for a period of time, which would have crossed over with a board meeting.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to have been on the list, she would have had to specifically come up to Virginia and say, put me on the list, vet my qualifications, and approve me. That to me is much more problematic than the timing. I think the timing is a little bit of a red herring, honestly, given what I've seen of how long it takes to hire a superintendent. And that goes to your point, by the way, Dr. Mann, of in the modern workplace of confidential movement. I think that's exactly right.
If I may,
Ms. Holton.
But you're absolutely right. It's the confidentiality, but how the confidentiality intersects with the timing issue. And so that I get back to the let's get our creative juices flowing and see if the VAS and VSBA folks and Patty and Susan can together come up with something that, maybe there's things we can do in executive session, or maybe we can have emergency meetings as needed. It's not going to happen a lot, I don't think. Many candidates will be already on the list. Many candidates will be, confidentiality won't be such a concern, so they can put in the regular course. Or divisions may be comfortable hiring people, announcing a hiring subject to the approval, the later approval of the person's qualifications by the board. So I think the cases where it's actually going to come, I wonder, I don't know whether the cases where it's actually going to come to a real question would be few and far between. But anyway, I come back to that. I don't know that we can solve it here, but I think that we ought to put it off and get our charge our team go back to the drawing board and see if they can come up with some creative alternatives.
Ms. Holton, if I would second the motion if you're making one.
No motion. I think we'll just defer this until
Okay.
the next meeting, but thank you, Francisco. And Susan, if you don't mind coordinating with Patty, or Patty, if you don't mind coordinating with Susan, let's get the VAS people involved, and perhaps, the school board folks, and see if there's a process that they would prefer that still does not, that meets the constitutional test here.
Be glad to
Be
work on
glad
that.
to.
No problem.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, item J, final review of proposed revisions to the regulations governing educational services for gifted students.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, actually, it's still morning. It's almost afternoon. President Gecker, Dr. Lane, Dr. Wilson, and members of the Board of Education. It's my pleasure to present to you the proposed changes for to the regulations governing the education of the gifted for final review. I'm going to share my screen now. Well, let me see what we got here. All right. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. During the discussion in September, the board requested that further revisions to the regulations, number one, require that the local gifted plan address their goals, objectives, and strategies to address underrepresentation of student groups, and require that the local gifted plan address their efforts to support the diversity goals of their academic year governor school if a participating member. These changes were included in red and with double underlining on page 11 of the board item. In addition, the board asked the VDOE to increase the transparency regarding the identification of gifted students. Since that time, we have initiated the process of adding gifted identification by race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomics to each school's school quality profile. The board also requested that we consider changes to the gifted annual report to include achievement measures that monitor underrepresentation and underachievement. These changes will include further tracking of diploma achievement, achievement on national and international assessments, and by requesting additional data on numbers of gifted referrals and gifted identification and highlighting underrepresented populations. Finally, the board requested a list of those individuals involved in the review and revision of the gifted regulations. That listing is included in your board book. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take any kind of questions. And then subsequently, the Superintendent of Public Instruction would recommend that the Board of Education accept the proposed regulations for final review.
Okay, well, thank you. Are there any questions? I guess none. Okay.
So President Gecker, I'm sorry, not
Yes,
a question, but a comment to Mr. Boland and Dr. Poland. Thank you very much for incorporating the suggestions and the changes we requested, particularly around aligning to goals, the gifted annual plan aligning to local goals, as well as this idea of accountability and how we seek to hold divisions and localities accountable to this, what I see as a clear step toward equity or making opportunities available to all of our students. So appreciate that response.
Indeed, I'm very thankful that you all did this. I guess I recently saw the data, Michael, that you may have put together with regard to identification among the various groups. And, you know, it's sort of, I wouldn't say shocking because you knew it was there, but it is stark to see it out, you know, in black and white on the screen, just how, you know, off it is in terms of percentage of population versus percentage identified as gifted in the various divisions. Of course, I would note if you live in Northern Virginia, your chances are about 1 in 4 of being gifted. So based on the data that I saw, so it may be time to just move our kids up there and improve our odds. If you've looked at the data, you know what I'm talking about. It is the percentage of people tagged gifted in various divisions varies widely. And Northern Virginia seems to, as a general rule, tag more gifted than most of the rest of the Commonwealth. All right.
President Gecker, pardon me for interrupting again.
No, it's all right. Emily, you may mute her if you want. Go ahead, Dr. Wilson.
I'll mute myself in just a second. But just to acknowledge that we had a fair amount of public comment around this item and or tangentially comments around identification or practices around admissions in the Northern Virginia area. So I do want to acknowledge that there was a lot of comment in our for the board in this month.
There was.
Now I'm going on mute.
No, that's all right. Although with regard to the admissions in particular, that has been or is being handled as a local matter, I think, in Fairfax, as I understand the way that's going. Although I did see that my home county just recently adopted new rules in terms of sending, you know, how to identify candidates for Maggie Walker, which I certainly appreciate. In any event, is there a motion to adopt these? Item J.
Moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Duran. Okay, by roll call, Ms. Holton,
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Foss,
Aye.
Dr. Duran,
Aye.
Dr. Wilson,
Aye.
Dr. Mann,
Aye.
and I vote aye. Okay, moving on. Item K, final review of the addition of state-approved textbooks for K-12 science. Ms. Peterson.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. I am here today to present a revision to the state-approved textbooks list for K-12 science. As you know, it is the responsibility of the Board of Education to approve textbooks for use in Virginia public schools. These approved textbooks align to the state's academic standards and are one resource that divisions may use when providing science instruction. On September 17, 2020, the board approved the state-approved textbooks for K-12 science with the exception of one textbook, and that textbook was Virginia Elevate Science, grade 6. This text was not approved due to a lack of diversity that was ascertained through an additional equity review of the proposed textbooks. This additional review was done at the request of the board during the July 23, 2020 meeting. Since the proposed textbook was reviewed by textbook review teams and was found to align to the 2018 Sciences Standards of Learning, the publisher was allowed to update the images to reflect a greater level of diversity. Once the images were updated, the publishers resubmitted the text for inclusion on the state-approved textbooks for K-12 science. The updated images were reviewed by the VDOE science team and shared with board members, and it was determined that these revised images reflect a higher level of diversity, thus allowing students the opportunity to see themselves, their community, and their culture within the text. Our next steps are to provide professional development on how to use textbooks, as well as other resources in the development and implementation of quality science instruction. The quest for equitable science instruction for all students of Virginia must continue to be emphasized in all of our work moving forward. I'd like to thank you all for your courteous attention and consideration, and the Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends that the board receive for final review the attached revised list of textbooks for K-12 science. I would be happy to answer any questions at this time.
First, let me say sorry about Ms. Peterson. It's Dr. Peterson.
No problem.
It is difficult for me sometimes to remember who is doctor and who is not. So Are there any questions or comments here? Ms. Holton?
Yes, I'd first just like to thank Dr. Peterson and colleagues for helping us get this right. And the publisher has in fact made good changes, I think, to this book. They didn't add a lot of pictures, but there aren't a whole lot of pictures of people in the book to start with. And the changes that they made do, I think, allow students to see of all backgrounds and demographics to see themselves as scientists. Particularly they've got a sort of career options part of the textbook series. And so I think the changes in this are good. My only regret, frankly, is that, well, or the lesson learned is that these publishers will respond to our concerns. And, you know, this was the book we identified as the worst offender. There were others that we might have wanted to nudge, but focused only on the worst offender. And so I think the lesson for the future is we should feel free to speak up and share our concerns, because the publishers can and will be responsive to those concerns. And then the other lesson is that when I know that Dr. Peterson and team are working on this, though maybe this is a more department-wide effort, we do need to remember to revise our textbook criteria to make sure that this equity piece is part of what we get from in the first place. I am supportive of these changes. I don't actually have a question. I'm just thanking you, Dr. Peterson, and thanking the publisher for making changes. And I would be supportive of adding this textbook to the list that we approved last month now.
Okay, any other comments? Dr. Wilson, and then Dr. Cron.
Just a brief comment to acknowledge that I appreciate the written report in our materials, which get to high quality instructional materials, where I see there is a mention here of equity and cultural relevance, which I think gets to Ms. Holden's point just a bit ago about this particular, this science textbooks, but generally speaking, the entire process with that particular lens. So thank you for that.
Okay, anybody else? Dr. Duran?
I just wanted to reiterate what Ms. Holton said, and thank you, Dr. Peterson, for taking that time to really work with the publishers to ensure this. And Ms. Holton, I want to thank you because you actually brought it up here at the board level, and appreciate you doing that for all of us to look deeper into this. And Dr. Peterson, besides that, though, what I saw with the revisions and your presentation before, I could tell that you are leading the work through an equity lens and ensuring that. And so adding this other piece to that, tool, we constantly want to add more tools to our toolbox and how we can improve that. I know that you have already done that, and we'll do that for future ones. So I just want to thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Mr. Duran, can I just respond to say I've been channeling Ms. Lodel. This is a role she always played for us.
You have, she did. Doing it well.
Emily, feel free. Yes.
I echo everyone's sentiments without delaying your progress.
Thank you. All right. Is there a motion then to add this book to the list?
So moved.
Ms. Holton, and then second.
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Ms. Holton?
Aye.
Ms. Davis-Vaught?
Aye.
Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Dr. Wilson?
Aye.
Dr. Mann?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Now, we've been doing this about 2 hours. We've got a couple more items to go. I am content to push through, but also content if you want to take a 10-minute break.
Please, sir.
Push through.
Oh, push through. I'm sorry. Ms. Davis-Vaught, was that push through or take a break?
Take a restroom break.
Yes.
I think we'll do that. Okay, we'll be back at about 12:05.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Gecker.
Oh, I think it was good for all of us. to save this vote, so that's good. Yes, we are waiting for Dr. Duran and Ms. Holton.
I'm here, sorry, I didn't turn my computer.
Oh, no, that's fine. Let's just go. Hey, Ms. Walsh, are you back?
I am back.
Good, thank you. I guess, Ms. Holton, are you back?
Yes.
Oh, good, okay. All right, then I guess we can get started again. We'll move on to item L, the first review of amendments to licensure regulations for school personnel, et cetera. Ms. Pitts and Ms. Walsh.
Good afternoon, President Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. It is my pleasure to present the review of amendments to regulations and guidelines. This action is to amend the licensure regulations for school personnel, which are outlined in Attachment A, procedural guidelines for conducting licensure hearings, please refer to Attachment B, and the regulations governing the review and approval of education programs in Virginia, and refer to your board item, page K, to comport with Virginia General Assembly legislation in the 2019 and 2020 sessions. The 2019 session speaks solely to reprimands, and there are multiple revisions based upon the 2020 General Assembly. The regulations are to be revised under the fast track rulemaking requirements of the Administrative Process Act, and that is because these are based upon legislation and are codified. Therefore, we can use the fast track rulemaking. Before we present the revisions and amendments, I wanted to begin with a couple of preliminary comments on the format of our presentation. In Attachment A, you will see highlighted in gray text. That denotes text that is actually going through the Administrative Process Act now that was previously approved by the board. It is to give you context, but it is not part of your action today. I will briefly overview the amendments to the licensure regulations that are highlighted in Attachment A in yellow, as well as the approved program regulations changes that begin on page K in your board item. Nancy Walsh will present the proposed revisions regarding reprimands in the licensure regulations, Attachment A, that are highlighted in blue, and also the guidelines regarding hearings, and those are in red font in Attachment B. Now we will begin with the proposed regulatory amendments. I'm going to swiftly go through these. If you have specific questions or want more detail, please let me know, but I know that you have already reviewed this item. House Bill 1568 and Senate Bill 978 require that persons seeking a technical professional license with an endorsement to teach military science can have either the appropriate credential that's required by the United States military or a recommendation from a Virginia employing educational agency. The latter would be a non-military course in leadership. If you'll reference page 8 in attachment A, you will see text to address House Bill 1613 to permit any individual who seeks a technical professional license to substitute completion of an intensive job-embedded 3-year program of professional development that must be pre-approved by the Department of Education for the 9 hours of professional studies. House Bill 1630 expands the period of time in which an extension of a license that will expire can be recommended to be changed to a renewable license. This is for individuals who hold provisional license, who've met all other requirements, who have taken all licensure tests, but who have not met all of them, may receive, under very specific criteria, recommendation for a superintendent for a full license. And you can refer to that language on page 4. On page 3, you will see language to reflect House Bill 1469 and Senate Bill 680, which will allow schools for students with disabilities that are licensed by the Board of Education to request an extension. That's already allowable by superintendents and school divisions can make that request, and this expands that to those schools that you license. The last bill that I would like to overview is House Bill 894. And this bill is relative to not only the licensure regulations, but also the change in the regulations governing the review and approval of education programs in Virginia. So I'm going to cover it once, but it has to be included in both sets of regulations. In this bill, it requires that for initial licensure, or if you're in a college or university program, an individual must receive instruction or training on positive behavior interventions and supports, crisis prevention and de-escalation, the use of physical restraint and seclusion, consistent with regulations of the board, and appropriate alternative methods to reduce and prevent the need for the use of physical restraint and seclusion. You will see the language incorporated on page 6 in attachment A and on page K. I am pleased to tell you that Sam Hollins and her team actually developed the training to meet this requirement. So we're very excited about the fact that we can deliver this training, and the colleges and universities have already started to use it. So unless there are any specific questions about those revisions, I would like to turn it over to Nancy Walsh, and she is going to cover the information on the reprimands. But one other point of clarification is that the Advisory Board on Teacher Education and Licensure did review all of this information at its September meeting. So they had a full discussion, understood that these are requirements required by the statute. Thank you.
Good afternoon, President Gecker, Dr. Lane, and members of the board. I'm pleased to appear before you this afternoon and provide information, as Patty said, on those amendments to the licensure regulations that address written reprimands of license holders. I also will address the revisions to the procedural guidelines for conducting licensure hearings. In providing information to you this afternoon, I will address 3 areas. First, I will go over the legislation, both from the 2019 General Assembly and the 2020 General Assembly, that address these pieces of legislation that address reprimand. And going over the legislation, I think, will give you some context for the specific revisions to the licensure regulations. So first, we will look at legislation. Second, I will have you turn to attachment A, the section in attachment A that includes highlights in blue. Those are the ones that address reprimand. And then very briefly, the third item I will address are the changes to the procedural guidelines. So first, if you look at the agenda item itself, agenda item L, we will go over the pieces of legislation. And these are summarized on page C. This is section 2 on written reprimand. And you will note that in 2019, the General Assembly made 3 legislative changes relating to reprimand. The first is a change to section 22.1, 292.1A, which allows the board to issue a written reprimand of a license holder for any of the violations of secure mandatory tests listed there. So back in 2019, the General Assembly identified that there could be some testing violations for which the board should have the authority to issue a written reprimand of the license holder as opposed to taking action against the license itself. The second change in 2019 identified a different area where the board should have authority to issue a written reprimand, and that was the change to 22.1304, which addresses employment breaches. So situations in which a license holder breaches his or her employment contract and the school board does not release that license holder from a contract, the legislation here was revised to allow the board to issue a written reprimand. The board is not required to do that. It still could revoke or suspend the license, but that was added in 2019. And the third change in 2019 was a change to 22.1, 298.1, which simply indicated that the board's regulations, that the board issue regulations that include procedures for written reprimands of license holders. So in 2019, we had 2 very narrow circumstances, the secure mandatory test violations and the employment contract violations, and then authority to issue regulations. In 2020, the General Assembly made 2 additional changes with legislation, and those are described in the agenda item on page D. And the most important of those is the change. The General Assembly went back to 298.1 and significantly broadened the description of the regulations to be promulgated by the board. And I'm just going to note here that the legislation requires licensure regulations include procedures for written reprimands, quote, on grounds established by the Board of Education in accordance with law. So here, the General Assembly clarified that the board should have the authority to identify any circumstances as long as they are in accordance with law for which it should have the authority to issue reprimands. And I'm noting that because the reason that the regulations were not changed sooner in response to the 2019 changes are because arguably those changes applied only to the very narrow circumstances of employment contract violation and testing violations. But when the department became aware that additional legislation was underway in 2020 to make it clear that the board would have greater authority in its regulations, that's why you're seeing both years of changes together. The only other change made in 2020 was a very technical change to 22.1304 that added the word suspension to the contract violation cases, because for some reason, the code previously just referenced revocation of a license as a possible sanction for an employment contract violation. So now 304 lists revocation, suspension, and written reprimand. So that's just some background for you on the legislation that's driving these amendments. I'm going to ask you now to look at attachment A, As Mrs. Pitts noted, there are different colors of shading throughout this document, but I am going to direct you to the shading in blue and just very briefly walk you through the licensure regulation amendments relating to reprimand. The first is on page 4. This is just the definition of a written reprimand. And as you can see, it's defined very simply as a written admonishment of a license holder that does not result in withdrawal of the license. On the very same page, you see the definitions of revocation and suspension, and those two are adverse actions against the license that do result in withdrawal. One is temporary and one revocation is defined as just the withdrawal. So now we're going to jump to kind of the end of the licensure regulations and really look at the heart of the revisions. On page 24, there's a number of little pieces of blue throughout the document, but those are mostly just citation changes based on a newly added section on written reprimand. On page 24, we have a section on written reprimand, and this section provides the reasons that a written reprimand may be issued by the board. So the first two are the ones I already mentioned from the 2019 General Assembly. For any of the violations relating to mandatory tests is specified in section 22.1 to 92.1 of the code. The second reason is the breach of an employment contract. So if the board decided that written reprimand of the license holder was appropriate, it could choose to issue that reprimand. The number 3 here clarifies that the board is going to have significant discretion in the circumstances when it issues a written reprimand. Under this section of the revised regulations, the board, in accordance with law and at the discretion of the board, after reviewing the specific facts and circumstances of a case and determining that the license holder's conduct is not sufficiently serious or harmful to merit withdrawal, the board may issue a written reprimand. In number 3, there is an exception. This references it could issue for any of the reasons listed for revocation or suspension, with the exception that it cannot issue a written reprimand for a conviction of a violent felony set forth in the definition of a barrier crime, or for any offense involving the sexual molestation, physical or sexual abuse, or rape of a child. And for your information, this exception, this language referring to barrier crimes and sexual and physical and sexual abuse and rape of a child, that language is the same as the language that was included in a recent piece of legislation that became effective this year, July 1, 2020. Many of you may be aware that, as President Gecker mentioned earlier today, school divisions previously under section 22.1 to 96.1 were not able to employ individuals convicted of a felony, any felony. This year, effective July 1, the General Assembly put into effect changes to that section that clarified that a school division may, it's not required to, but it may employ individuals convicted of a felony, as long as that felony is not a barrier crime as defined in the code, or it is not one of these other offenses listed here in the amended regs. So just as school divisions may not hire individuals convicted of these types of offenses, the board is not going to have the authority under the regs to just issue a reprimand if that's the type of offense that you are reviewing. The other exception here is in B of the newly added 23-760. The board may not issue a written reprimand in cases in which it has become notified of a dismissal or resignation under section 313, and in the case of a founded case of child abuse, if it remains on the registry. Those of you who have heard from me during executive session should be familiar with language in the code in 22.1 to 98.1 that says the board shall revoke a license in certain circumstances. This this language here tracks that. So again, if a case falls under those circumstances when the code requires revocation, clearly the board is not going to be authorized to issue a written reprimand of the license holder. So that's just this is the actual section that deals with written reprimand. Procedurally, I'd like to point out that this section differs from the previous sections on revocation and suspension from 720 and 740. For revocation or suspension, a petition for either of those actions is initiated by local school divisions or by Dr. Lane on behalf of the Board of Education. Written reprimand is not going to be treated similarly. It is only an action that the board has the discretion to decide on for a license holder. We will not have, under the amended regulations as proposed to you, a situation where a school division may petition for a written reprimand. It would simply be a sanction, a discipline of the license holder that the board could decide on if this case, as it determines, is not sufficiently serious or harmful enough to warrant suspension or revocation. The only other thing I wanted to point out to you in attachment A, at the very end, you do have a section on notification. And so we have added written reprimand to the other license actions that are listed there for notification. So notification of revocation, suspension, cancellation, denial, or reinstatement, or the written reprimand of a license holder would be reported as indicated in that section. Very briefly, pardon me?
Oh, I was just going to give the superintendent's recommendation.
Okay, I just wanted very briefly to look at attachment B. That's the procedural guidelines for conducting licensure hearings. There are very minor changes there to simply indicate that it is another action that the board would have at its disposal. One thing I wanted to mention in the section on the panel's recommendations, the investigative panel could recommend written reprimand after reviewing a case. Similarly, Dr. Lane could make a recommendation for reprimand after he hears about the case, after the case has gone through the panel. At the very end of the guidelines, it mentions that the board may issue a written reprimand. I'll let Patty go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm sorry, I jumped in a little early. The superintendent of public instruction recommends that the board receive these amendments for first review.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation. Are there any comments or questions at this point, or are we prepared to accept it for first review? Dr. Duran.
Thank you for that overview, Nancy. A couple questions on the written reprimand. Would that be something that the board would determine how long that's for, and would it, or is the written reprimand something that would always be there, that would be attached to the notification, or is it for a certain amount?
Dr. Duran, as drafted, the written reprimand would not, it would be just it's a one-time admonishment. It's my understanding as drafted that it would remain as part of the individual's licensure file the same way that a suspension or a revocation or a denial would be. Presently, we report those, as you know, to the NASDAQ clearinghouse. They remain there even if an individual's license has been reinstated. The license holder's record with NASDAQ would still reflect the date he or she had a suspended license or a revoked license, or we have had individuals who've been denied a license and then issued, and we would report the issuance of the license, but it would be part of the permanent licensure record.
Thank you. That clarifies. So be part of the permanent record. So the board wouldn't be determining we're going to give you a written reprimand for 6 months.
No, it's not a set time period the same way that a suspension would be.
Got it. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Anybody else? Ms. Holton.
You're on mute. You're on mute, Ms. Holton.
You're muted, Ann.
Whoops, sorry. Section B of that 760, 23-760 section, the exception that creates circumstances wherein we cannot you do a written reprimand. The subsection F of 22.1313, that refers to a circumstance where somebody's been fired with allegations of sexual misconduct. Is that what that is?
It could be sexual misconduct. It could also be as the result of a founded case of child abuse or neglect. That there's different types of notifications, but one is indeed for sexual misconduct. Others could be physical abuse that results in a founded case of child abuse.
But it's, in other words, it's not whenever the local division has done dismissal or resignation. It's not all right.
Not
Okay.
all. It's a very
Thank
narrow subset, actually.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Anybody else? Any comments or questions? If not, we will see this again next month, and we'll accept it for first review. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, item M, first review of the board's annual report. Ms. Webb?
Good afternoon, President Gecker. Can everybody hear me? I was on double mute, so hopefully everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, President Gecker, Dr. Wilson, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. I'm pleased to present for first review the board's 2020 annual report on the condition and needs of public schools in Virginia. As you will note in the boilerplate, this report is required by 22.1-18 of the Code of Virginia. This section outlines the requirements for the report, including the current standards of quality, information on student and parent choice, including charter school and virtual school options, as well as a report on all of the required reports that local school divisions are required to submit to the state or federal government. I will note that some of these reports were in the process of being finalized when this item was posted in your board book and on the website, so you do not see them in the appendices, but they will be included for final review and can be provided to you in the next draft in the interim. The annual report presents the needs of public education in Virginia, an update on the board's work over the past year, and a summary of achievement of students and schools. Much of this report focuses on research relevant to the priorities outlined in your comprehensive plan and to the standards of quality, which you unanimously re-prescribed at your September board meeting. Unless noted, staff has reviewed and revised all data points, charts, and graphs with the most recent data available. Additionally, once the text of the report is finalized, an executive summary will be added for your review and approval in November, along with more information on the board's accomplishments that have been approved this fall. The Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends that the Board of Education receive for first review the 2020 annual report on the conditions and needs of public schools in Virginia. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll also note doing this in a virtual setting is somewhat different, since I know we usually have a work session on the annual report. And I'm happy, we can have a conversation now, and I'm also happy to work with individual board members in between first and final review should we need to work out some language.
All right, any preliminary comments? And thank you, Emily, for the work on this. I will say, as you noted, being virtual has, I think, hurt us a little bit, not in terms of the quality of the output, but certainly in terms of the process that we've used. I candidly have not been quite as diligent as I would like to be yet going through this. Although, I appreciate having had the advanced copy. For members of the board, it is no secret that I view this, as well as the comprehensive work plan, as two very important documents. I know for a long period of time, the annual reports were just sort of copied over, cut and paste, and things moved on. But this is one of the few times that we speak in document form about where the board's going and what we believe. And so, to the extent that you have not had a chance yet to actually go through this with some detail, I would appreciate it if you did. I know, Dr. Duran, you've got your hand up. I'll get you in just a second. it'd be good within the next 2 weeks if we could have any comments back so that we can try to integrate this. I will say the condition of schools today, given, virtual, hybrid, and, some full-on instruction, I think needs to be highlighted. It has certainly raised some issues that ought to be highlighted. And although I'm comfortable with this as a first draft, I think that we need to, like I said, pay particular attention. This is if we are to be taken seriously, then the work product here needs to be taken seriously. And it is my desire to put out something that accurately and fully represents where we think we are in the Commonwealth today. Dr. Duran?
Thank you. Quick question, Emily, on page 11, with regards to the number, there's a comment there, highlighted section, and it indicates the number of English learners and the data there. But the comment is, look at a 5-year trend, the data is weird in 2010. Can you explain that to me?
Yes, absolutely. And I may not be able to explain all the technicalities of it, and that was a comment for myself and probably should have been removed. But there was a different data collection for the years of 2010, school year 2010, 2011, which really skews the increases that we saw in English learner students. And so when I was working with Dr. Paiva-Rena on updating some of this data, she had recommended that we look at a 5-year correlation or 5-year increase versus 10-year, because for that 1 year, it was a different data collection that really doesn't translate well to how we've done it in the past. And so I am planning to look at that and work with her to make sure that we get those numbers correct in between first and final review.
Okay.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Anybody else? Ms. Holton?
Thank you, Emily. That does help. Appreciate that.
So Emily, I'm with President Gecker in that I haven't been as diligent on it as I would like to be, and will try to take a close read on it expeditiously and offer you any feedback. From my quicker look, I do think, just one, I also want to reiterate President Gecker's remarks about how important this document is. It is how we collectively speak. And frankly, I don't know when we send it over to the General Assembly whether anybody reads it or not, but we get the opportunity to quote it, and others do too. So we can use it throughout the year in our conversations with legislators and other stakeholders. And I think it is used in that capacity and is extremely valuable. So some of the recitation of issues about teacher shortages, for instance, it establishes a record that is a basis for other actions where we don't otherwise collectively speak to all these issues in a documented way. So that's just reiterating the importance. I do think there are references to the pandemic. And I do think it's good that you've maintained the long-term comprehensive plan focus and the SOQ, the justification for the SOQ changes we have made. But I do think the pandemic, and there are references throughout to the effects of the pandemic, but it's not enough. There really needs to be a section up front that acknowledges in some detail what the needs and conditions of public education in Virginia right now are, that X number of divisions started completely virtual, X number of divisions are doing hybrid, et cetera, the extraordinary efforts being put out by educators all across the Commonwealth to try to meet the needs of families, and yet that we are all struggling with the challenges, all the efforts the department has gone through to help get this the pandemic's dashboard up, to give guidance to the divisions, and then to get this most recently, this pandemic dashboard up, acknowledging all that hard work, acknowledging where we are and where we aren't. I think one thing that we probably ought to talk about is how the average daily membership numbers are going to be way down this fall. And that I don't think that that's, well, I know we don't think that's necessarily reflective of future ADMs post-pandemic. Obviously, nobody knows, but that we, and I don't know what happened in the General Assembly budget conference that was, results were posted yesterday. So I know there was a difference between the two houses and how much waiver they were promising the divisions on the consequences of the enrollment drop this fall in terms of budget. So maybe that's been resolved for the immediate budget year in a satisfactory way, but we would want to lay a foundation for discussions about that topic among others going forward. And I know you will go back and update. I do see you have reference to the racial justice issues and the work of the commission. And I know you'll go back and update that for our work, what action we took and the hard work of the department going forward.
Absolutely. I'm happy to actually, we can add a COVID pandemic section, make sure that is front and center, not a problem at all. I can work with Holly and Dr. Lane and other staff to make sure that we capture everything that has been going on and kind of where our school divisions are right now. And can get another draft out to you all even before we send out the next board book in November.
Just something that reflects the extraordinary challenges the divisions are facing, the extraordinary efforts they and the department have taken to address those challenges, but huge gaps remaining and uncertainty. So yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. No problem.
Dr. Mann?
Yes, I also thank you for giving us a chance to look at this early on and share feedback on follow-up. I'm thinking about also trying to have some representation in here around the work that's happening in early ed within the department under A. Maybe there's a small call out. There's been a tremendous number of activities that have happened to sort of bring this under the umbrella of ed. And I think it'd be great under the equity, the section 1 where we focus on equity, that maybe have a call out around that. I realize that we're still at the very early stages of having that work more fully integrated within the department, but there certainly has been a fair bit of progress along that path, and seeing that called out more actually, I'm sure will help people appreciate that this is also important work that's being done within it. So.
Absolutely. Happy to work with Jenna and her team on adding some information about early childhood.
Anybody else? James, do you know where the budget language came out with regard to the, holding schools harmless for ADM?
Yes, that did not make it through the special session. What they did there is actually asked us not to adjust the ADM payments, but to come back to them in January with more information following the September 30th report. It wasn't ready by the time they were starting to wrap up the budget. And so my gut feeling is that they'll take that issue back up in January. What I can tell you today is our analysis of it has it budget neutral from the state. Obviously, if there's no hold harmless, it would be significantly impactful to school districts, but the money is there to make up the gap and the loss of students because we budgeted for a higher number of students. And so more to follow in January. Can't speak to the governor's position on it, can't speak to what the General Assembly will do, but I think that'll be a big topic in January.
No, but it is an opportunity, or actually, I think almost a mandate for us to speak to it in terms of what the impact of effectively not holding them harmless would be for the locals. I mean, wasn't the VSBA number like 150 million on the hold harmless? It was a big number, as I recall.
And I would say that that's an unofficial number, but yes, the VAS did produce a number that was closer to 150 million that would be lost revenue for school districts. And of course, we have that revenue sitting in the budget currently, so it's really a policy issue.
Right. In other words, they have not reallocated.
But yes, you can speak to it.
They have not reallocated that money to other pieces yet, is what you're saying when you say.
No, they have not.
Okay. And so I do think it's important in terms of the policy. I mean, the impact of that loss would be significant. So she's, you can't plan this way either if you're a local. It makes it very, very difficult. Dr. Mann, I think you're speaking, but you're on mute.
Are there things that can, well, I'm asking this perhaps. I think that's a very important point. And I think to the extent that there are things that can be done individually or collectively by the board to express an opinion on this, when you read the condition of schools and see we're already at a C- when it comes to finance and education, and the reality of the work being so much more intensive under these circumstances, to say nothing of the comment you made about planning, because we don't know what's going to be required as we move through the rest of this year. So I sort of would be interested in thinking about what is within our realm to collectively state on that point. It's a very important concern.
Anybody else have any comments on this? Emily, I know you're taking notes, so I'm not even going to ask.
So President Gecker, just
Yes.
one minor point to expand on what Dr. Mann is saying. The impact is of COVID, loss of revenue, all of those things are right now certainly into next semester. But I am concerned that we perhaps lay a marker for the ongoing, the longer term, the lag, the tail of the impact of COVID. We can't see it yet. And so to somehow acknowledge that the condition of our schools potentially may feel the effects of COVID for much longer than any of us can now see. So that we give ourselves space to, as we learn more. We heard from superintendents a month ago. We've heard from organizations just yesterday in our committee meeting. I think we're going to continue to see those impacts, and we should lay a marker, I think, now, so that in this report, so we can take it up in future years if necessary.
Okay, now we've all, or most of us, have expressed some ideas that are going to go into this report. It is manifestly unfair for us to just assume that Emily can capture what you have in your mind. So it is incumbent upon us to, actually take the time. I'm not asking you to draft the report, but to make more detailed notes about what it is we think is important, you think is important, so that they can be incorporated, and also to do that fairly quickly. Within the next week would be awesome. And I can work with Emily, or somebody who writes better than I do can work with Emily to, flesh this out, and hopefully a draft that'll make it through the next meeting. But this is time sensitive. It is, as I said, going into this, I think particularly important that we lay it out. A lot of what we do, as you know, is seemingly ignored. I felt for a while now bad that my, favorite thing we've done, the SOQs, seem to be ignored, but yet I go places and people say to me, you guys did great work on this, they'll catch up to you. And so, wrong to think that what we say just goes into some big hole somewhere, never to be heard of again. I think we need to create the echo, and that will resonate and eventually change minds about where we need to be. So I have nothing else to say on this, honestly, other than, I have told people, and I believe it strongly, we are the hardest working board in the Commonwealth, certainly the hardest working unpaid board in the Commonwealth. And, this is one of those times where that hard work needs to be put out. So that's the charge. Anybody else on this?
Thanks. I was going to say thank you, President Gecker, for that. I have taken a lot of notes, and will certainly capture as much as I can, but, even bulleted notes from board members would certainly be helpful to make sure that we get this in a good form before it goes to final review in November.
Okay, so thank you all. Items N and O are written reports. You can read those at your leisure. And we move on to discussion of current items. Are there any other items that we have not hit upon in this meeting that you'd like to talk about? Dr. Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Gecker. Just a couple things, and some of this will come back to you in your next board meeting, but we sent the board a copy by email of the JLARC report on the operations and management of the Department of Education. Whereas that report, even as stated by JLARC, was overwhelmingly positive, it certainly gave us some areas to improve on. And I just wanted to assure the board we're working on those matters, updating our strategic plan, and we'll have a brief for you on that the next time we get together. I also want to, as I always do, give you an update on the status of what's going on in schools as it relates to the pandemic. I try to be brief here, but I will tell you since the last time we got together, the VDH has released a new pandemic dashboard that you can go to on their website. I search pandemic dashboard, and then it's got a tab for CDC metrics that's really guiding a lot of the school divisions thinking around the data in their home communities. CDC has two core metrics. One is, essentially cases over 14 days. The other is percent positivity, and then they have sub-core metrics, and then requirements that school divisions meet mitigation strategies. But as we've started reporting that data and school divisions are starting to assess that it's more safe, I did want to let you know that we are seeing a trend that more school divisions are starting to implement at a minimum the hybrid model. We recommend essentially that if you're in the highest risk of transmission, that you go back to our phase 1 guidelines in coordination with VDH. If you're in the moderate to high risk category, we recommend that you implement phase 2 guidelines. And if you're in the lower category, we recommend phase 3 guidelines. As a reminder, phase 3 is essentially every student, as long as you meet the physical distancing requirements and masking and cleaning and health and everything else. Phase 2 is a focus on early childhood, special education, and EL learners, English language learners. And then phase 1, of course, focuses on getting our special education students their services. And so with that transition to more school divisions going back, we're continuing to adjust our support and technical assistance to school divisions and meeting with superintendents on a regular basis. My daughter today got on a bus at 9:13 a.m. To travel to school for the first time that she's been in person since March. My homeschool division allowed K2 back a little early, and then the older students will come back later. But the excitement on our face was certainly palpable for our family. But our school divisions are continuing to make decisions about what's safest. Some school divisions have certainly taken a more measured approach. Their data calls for it. Their staffing needs call for it. And so we're continuing to monitor that. We'll be doing a new update to our map on November 6th to give you a sense of exactly what every school division is doing with this latest round of enhancements. I can go into way more detail on any of those, but I know you've been at this for a long time, and so that's the highest level overview I can give. And thank you for the moment. Thank you.
Now, James, would you mind addressing something that, at least for me, was counterintuitive when we heard it? We were on a call the other day with a division superintendent who indicated that the full virtual, the 5-day virtual, actually might yield better academic results than the blended model. And I think you mentioned to me that may be consistent with other research that's coming out. As I said, because it took me aback as somewhat counterintuitive, and maybe it shouldn't have been, it might be worth addressing.
Yeah, thank you. And I would not say that we have peer-reviewed research to support this. And so there are some reports coming from other states, but so know that I think we'll need time to say that the research fully supports this. But there are parents questioning, probably is the best way for me to say it, whether 2 days of in-person instruction in the hybrid model, and then essentially because the teacher has to teach the other half of the students the rest of the week, the student is essentially asynchronous the rest of the week. That's the most popular hybrid model, where students will go on Monday, Tuesday, the school will do a deep clean on Wednesday, the other half of the class essentially goes on Thursday, Friday. That's the most popular hybrid model. That essentially gives students 2 full days of direct instruction with their teacher and 3 asynchronous days. There are a lot of questions about whether that is equally as effective or more effective than having your teacher with you all day, every day, 5 days a week in the virtual setting. And frankly, I think the best advice that I could give a school district on that is it depends. It depends on how well you're doing your mitigation strategies. It depends on how well you're doing with your virtual program. It depends on frankly, the poverty of the family and what access they have to the internet and the quality of the resources that they're provided. But it also depends on the age of the student. I've had great conversations with Ms. Davis-Fott. She will tell you, I think unequivocally, that the earliest learners definitely benefit from that in-person, even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week. And so, there are a lot of factors there before I would come out with a hard recommendation on that. But I don't think that we should completely pan, if you will, the virtual setting, because there are some benefits to the length of time that students are engaging together and with the teacher. And so I think our measure that we've taken at the department to really allow this to be a local focus based on the context of their data, their students' situations is probably the best strategy moving forward. But there are benefits and negatives to every model that's not 5 days a week in person with the teacher, because of the pandemic. And we're not recommending 5 days a week with every student in person with the teacher because of safety reasons. But in the context of the options that school divisions have, I think they're making decisions in the best interest of their communities.
The overarching point is that we need to, I think, keep good watch on this and the data that comes out, act as the clearinghouse and perhaps act as the advice-giving agency for, if this continues, how it ought to continue. And also, frankly, since my heightened concern over the quality of virtual learning and the disparity between quality, in different places, continuing to look for best practices as we see them, see where we get results, and perhaps throw them out as a statewide model.
And thank you. I just wanted to add one point I didn't say, and that is, I think the board will be pleased to hear, and we are working on your quarterly reports that you requested as part of the 990 waiver process. And I know the president and vice president have a draft of the types of things we're going to collect coming. But the quality of virtual, I can say unequivocally now, 6 months later, is much better than what our students were experiencing in March, April, and May. The school divisions did a great job of training teachers over the summer. I think that, when it's safe in person is always going to be, I think the goal for our school divisions. But even anecdotally with my own children, talking to school divisions, sitting in on virtual, seeing in person, the board should be pleased with the progress our school divisions are making to make virtual as high quality as it can be right now. And I think that I know you've had concerns, Mr. Gecker, but I've been proud of what I've seen thus far.
Good. Anybody else? Any comments, questions, or additions? If not, I'd like to thank everybody, DOE staff. Dr. Duran, I'm sorry.
Just a quick acknowledgement. A reminder that in 2009 that the General Assembly designated October around the Commonwealth as Disability History and Awareness Month. And I know the VDOE and Superintendent Lane had sent out some information to school divisions, and just want to remind us all as we think about that to honor and the contributions and achievements of people with disabilities this month. And there's a lot of great online activities that are happening through VDOE. So thank you, Dr. Lane and the VDOE staff for putting those out. And just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
I feel sure that I have some staff members who would enjoy inviting you to Zoom sessions and lessons if you'd like to do that.
I actually asked the last superintendent we were on the phone with, James and I, if I could do that. I've yet to receive my invitation. So yeah, I'd love to do that, Pam. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that's it. One day I hope to see you guys in person again, but I think next month we'll probably be back doing it in the family Zoom context. So thank you all for your time and attention this morning, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, President Vicker.
Thank you.
Great to be with you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.